This episode is brought to you by Christendom, a big tent platform for Catholic content creators. Say goodbye to endlessly browsing for Catholic content. At Christendom, we make it simple to follow, share, and save your favorite creators' content. Join our community at christendom.app. It's free.
Hello, everybody. I am John Allen, and this is Last Week in the Church, the show where we look back over the week that was on the Vatican and the global church beat. As ever in the Pope Francis era, was a lot that went down. We begin with hard cases and bad law. The curious case of an Argentine priest who has been laicized, de-laicized, and then re-laicized has attracted all kinds of explanations to account for the bouncing ball of Vatican justice. I'm going to suggest an additional theory, and for bonus points, one that doesn't actually assume ill will on anybody's part. I know this is very countercultural in the hyper-politicized age in which we live, but what the heck, let's give it a shot. Second up this week, we've got the hard red line. If our first story illustrates a case in which it's hard to know exactly how guilty somebody is and what the appropriate punishment is, this one concerns a case where punishment is crystal clear and automatic. If you want to be an ex-priest in the Catholic Church, reminds me, of course, of the famous Monty Python ex-parrot sketch, but if you want to get kicked out of the Catholic priesthood, the automatic, infallible, easy-peasy way to do it is to suggest the Pope is actually an anti-Pope. We'll sort through some stories that illustrate the point. Third up this week, shifting of the spotlight. So of late, the scandals in the men's branch of a Peruvian movement known as the Sodalitium Christianae Vitae, or the sodality of Christian life, have been well documented, among other places. They've been abundantly documented on the Crux site by my wife, Elise Ann Allen. But of late, the spotlight has begun to shift a bit from the pathologies of the men's branch to similar situations in the women's branch, known as the Marian Community of Reconciliation, or colloquially as the Fraternas, a sort of shortened form of the Spanish name of the community. And my wife has been breaking ground here too. She has been interviewing ex-fraternas, that is, ex-members of the women's branch of this Peruvian group, who are coming forward, most for the very first time, to describe their experiences. We'll explain what they've had to say and what it all means. Fourth up this week, trouble with the tree. There's actually, believe it or not, a controversy surrounding the Vatican's Christmas tree. We'll explain what the hubbub is and unpack its significance. And then finally this week, we've got King Con. Not Kong, but Con. Here in Italy, the king of the Con was busted last week, attempting to impersonate a Vatican official while fraudulently attempting to take out a loan. We'll go through his story and explain why this is sort of a word to the wise for the coming Jubilee year. All that and more is waiting for you in this episode of Last Week in the Church, so please don't go anywhere. I will be right back. All right, everybody, welcome back. Happy Tuesday to you. Happy Tuesday, November 19th in 2024. For those of you who are Americans, that date, of course, means that Thanksgiving is right on the horizon. Here in Rome, on the other hand, this date is basically understood as the eye of the storm between the Synod of Bishops on synodality on the one side, the looming consistory for new cardinals on the other, and then, of course, the opening of the Jubilee year. But wherever you are and whatever particular purchase you have on today's date, I'm sure glad you're with us here today. All right, so we begin, as I teased at the top of the show, with hard cases and bad law. So recently, The odd case of an Argentinian, I guess you can call him now an ex-priest, Ariel Principi, has been raising eyebrows and setting tongues wagging because of the on again, off again, back on again nature of his laicization. Essentially, we're talking about a priest in Argentina who was accused of sexual abuse. An ecclesiastical tribunal, in the first instance, found him guilty and decreed dismissal from the clerical state in 2023. Principe appealed that verdict. It was upheld upon appeal. So his diocese in Argentina essentially, announced that this guy is gone. Then, this past September, the diocese posted a new communique saying, oops, no, actually, he's not gone. He's back in because the Holy See has decreed that his laicization has been lifted. This on the basis of what it described as new evidence from some diocesan bishops in Argentina and also some lay faithful in Argentina. It said, this communique said, a special process had been followed, which arrived at the conclusion that Principe was to be reinstated as a Catholic priest. This decree was signed by Venezuelan Archbishop Edgar Peña Parra, who is the sustituto, the substitute, the number 2 official in the Vatican Secretary of State. Just when you thought he was back in, however, just days later, the diocese posts yet another communique, this one from the Vatican's Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, signed by Irish Archbishop John Kennedy, who is the head of the disciplinary section, that is the department that handles abuse cases within the dicastery. And Kennedy essentially said, no, Principe has not been reinstated because the Secretary of State had no authority to do that. Responsibility for abuse cases lies entirely with us. And essentially, the verdict sticks. So, it's final, case closed, put a fork in it, it's done. Okay? Now, that's where things stand as of right now. As I say, therefore, barring any other developments, we can say that Principe is now Mr., not Father Principe. All right. Now, this back and forth is obviously a little unusual, huh? This is not something you see every day. And so, a number of sort of prefabricated, pre-existing, very familiar scripts have sort of been dusted off to try to explain what's going on here. One is the turf war between the Secretary of State and the Dicastery for the Faith. Over the centuries, these two departments in the Vatican have long battled for supremacy. For a long time, the Dicastery for the Faith had the upper hand. It has been known in Italian as La Suprema, or the Supreme Department of the Vatican. More recently, especially under Pope Paul VI, who was himself a veteran of the Secretariat of State, as well as his predecessor, actually, Pope Pius XII, the Secretariat of State began to gain the upper hand. So one way of looking at this is just another chapter in this sort of never-ending story of the Vatican's inner politics getting in the way of clarity and getting in the way of truth and justice. All right. Second script here. One thing I didn't tell you about Principe is that he is a 16-year veteran of the Catholic charismatic movement. And the accusations of abuse against him arose from his activity offering prayers of healing and liberation for people who professed a same-sex orientation, whom he was trying to heal, trying to liberate from the grip of this same-sex orientation. And so, for all those who regard attempts at, what's sometimes been known as conversion therapy, right? Attempts to undo somebody's sexual orientation through spiritual means, For everyone who regards that as dangerous and quite often homophobic, it's natural enough to believe that somebody in the system who shares Principe's prejudices probably mucked around trying to get him off the hook, and that would explain the sort of bouncing ball here. Now, yet a third script about all of this is that, well, to put it bluntly, it's the Pope's fault. People would say, hey, look at how he treated Bishop Gustavo Zanqueta, this Argentine bishop who had to flee his diocese facing accusations of sexual and financial corruption, but was welcomed with open arms by the Pope here in the Vatican. He was given a gig here in Rome. And, the Pope kind of wrapped him in a warm, loving embrace until he finally had to go back to Argentina and face the music. He was convicted there of sexual abuse and sentenced to 4.5 years in prison. Or people would say, look at the way the Pope has stood by Cardinal Victor Manuel Fernandez, the head of the Dicastery for the Faith, despite revelations regarding, well, to put it somewhat euphemistically, sexually, evocative writings early in his career that some people have found wildly inappropriate. Others would point to the case Maria Rupnik, the famed artist who has been accused of sexual abuse and misconduct by almost 30 women at this point, but who was also a member of the Pope's Jesuit community. And people would say, okay, this is just, once again, Francis trying to cover up for one of his boys, albeit in this case in a somewhat botched fashion. I could go on, but you get the point that there are a lot of frameworks that appeal to different groups for one, usually ideological reason or another, that have been brought to bear in the Principe case. I'd like to suggest, however, there is another explanation, and I'm somewhat surprised that other people haven't mentioned it more prominently, but nevertheless would make sense of the facts and also would have the side benefit of not ascribing malice to anybody in this situation. And the explanation would be this is simply a hard case. Okay? Yes, there are 3 accusers against Principe who have come forward in the canonical process against him. Now, it should be said, number one, these 3 accusers, we're not talking about young children. In the main, these were young men who were basically 17, very near 18, when these alleged incidents happened. What everyone agrees upon is that there were prayers for what? For liberation from homosexuality that involved, among other things, Principe during these prayers laying on hands on these guys, often on their genitalia. And where people differ is that these 3 accusers say that Principe was doing this for motives of sexual gratification. Principe has denied that strenuously, saying that there was no activity, as the Vatican would put it, for libidinous ends. And the truth is, that's a very hard thing to settle objectively in the absence of any physical indicators of sexual arousal, which the trial record suggests that there weren't any. And in fact, one of the accusers himself said that he wasn't sure, actually, what Principe's motives were. It also is worth noting that often these prayers that Principe did were performed in the company of other people, so it wasn't under the cover of darkness. And he professed that of these 3 victims, in at least one case, alleged victims that is, in at least one case, he actually thought the guy was an adult. Okay, so you add all that up. What you've got is obviously inappropriate conduct. I'm sorry, but no matter what the alleged spiritual good, a Catholic priest should not be putting his hands on the genitalia, or really of anybody, but certainly young men who are significantly younger than he is. I mean, that's just, no go, right? That's a no-fly zone. However, considering all the other facts, okay, how close to adulthood these accusers were, how there is no actual objectively satisfactory proof that Principe was acting for purposes of sexual gratification, you know, it is possible, at least, to conclude that this was inappropriate conduct, it was misconduct, but misconduct that does not rise to the level of abuse and therefore does not merit the canonical equivalent of the death penalty, which of course is involuntary laicization. And what this illustrates is that even after more than 25 years of the sex abuse scandals, we still do not have a crystalline clear definition of what does and does not constitute sexual abuse, because the dividing line between that and poor judgment and misconduct is often fairly difficult in practice to define. And that's why from the beginning some people have been saying that one size fits all punishment for a category of very disparate offenses perhaps isn't the best solution. My point is that reasonable people of good faith can look at this situation and draw different conclusions about how guilty Principe was and what punishment he deserved. And that may help explain the confusion and the bouncing ball of his verdict. Whether that's actually the situation, I don't know. But I would suggest under the law of Occam's razor, it's actually the simplest of the explanations that are on offer. And again, it also sees the situation through a hermeneutic of charity, which in my experience is never really all that bad a thing. All right. So second up this week, we go from hard cases to remarkably easy ones. In the past week, 2 more Italian priests have been punished for publicly declaring that Pope Francis is not the legitimate pope, that he is in fact an anti-pope, and saying, that therefore he does not merit their obedience. And in addition, they would argue that the fact he's not the legitimate pope has been proven by the various heresies which they claim he has lapsed into. So we're talking about Fernando Maria Cornet, an Argentine-born priest, who nevertheless, his family is from Sassari in the Italian island of Sardinia. And he's lived in Sassari since 2011. And then Giorgio Maria Pare, who is a member of the Discalced Carmelites. Now, Cornet has been laicized. Pare has been expelled from his order, so he's no longer a member of the Discalced Carmelites. By all indications, laicization may be right around the corner for him as well. Cornet expressed his views in a book cleverly titled Habemus Antipapam. As we have an anti-pope, and subtitled, by the way, Investigations in Honor of the Truth, or something like that. Pare, meanwhile, published his own little booklet and also articulated his views in a YouTube video. And again, the common theme here is that basically they think that Benedict XVI's resignation was never valid, so that Pope Francis was never validly elected pope. Cornet has suggested, or maybe it was Pare, I forget, I think it was Pare actually, has suggested that all of the cardinals who were named before 2013, that is, who have not been named by Pope Francis, now have a moral obligation to declare the See of Peter vacant and to convoke a conclave for electing a legitimate pope, i.e., I guess, one who thinks like Pare. Now, they actually join a small but, significant circle of Italian clergy who have been laicized for much the same reason. There's actually now a society of them here in Italy. They have a little community that they call Little Nazareth, where people of like minds can gather. Some of them sort of now have taken up a roving ministry. They go around, doing baptisms and what they claim to be legitimate, valid baptisms and marriages One of them is even ordaining other priests and consecrating religious women and so on. And if you want the ultimate proof that claiming that the Pope is invalid, that he's an anti Pope, is the quick route to being kicked out, I give you the case Raimondo Guidetti, who is a priest up in Tuscany, who last New Year's Eve, December 31st, used his homily at the New Year's Eve Mass to declare that Pope Francis was an anti Pope. He referred to him, well, he said that this Pope has presided over the false church of Bergoglio and his mercenaries. He said the Pope was the head of a band of Jesuit Masons and referred to Francis as a usurper. As I said, he said all of this on the evening of December 31st. Care to guess when his laicization was proclaimed? January 1st, 2024. That's right. It came less than 24 hours later. Proof positive that if you are looking to be laicized, this, ladies and gentlemen, is by far the right button to push. All right. So third up this week, we have a shifting of the spotlight. We have talked often on this program, and Crux and other media outlets have chronicled at some length the travails of a movement in Peru called the Sodality of Christian Life, founded in 1971 by a Peruvian layman named Luis Fernando Figare. And eventually it has spawned 4 different outfits. So there is the SCV proper, which is for consecrated men. There is a youth movement. There is a order of nuns. And there is also a women's branch for consecrated women, as I say, known as the Marian Community of Reconciliation, or informally as the Fraternas. Now, the focus up to this point very much has been on the men's community. It is currently under Vatican investigation. At this point, that investigation has resulted in the expulsion of 15 members from the community, including Figare, its founder. And there is some speculation that the end game to all this may be suppression of the community. We will see. But only in recent days has the spotlight begun to be trained not merely on the men's branch, but also on the women's. In this, I am proud to say, because of dogged and enterprising reporting by Crux, and let's face it, when I say by Crux, I don't mean me or anybody else who works for us. I mean my wife, Elise Ann Allen, who is herself a former, well, she's technically, I guess, is not a former fraternist. She was in formation to be a fraternist, but whatever. I mean, anyway, she was part of that world. And she has recently been talking to almost 30, actually, ex-members, and even a few current members of the organization. And what is remarkable is how the pattern of sort of systematic abuse, in some cases, sexual and physical abuse, quite often we're talking about psychological and spiritual abuse, abuses of authority and of conscience, how the pattern of that sort of conduct that they describe inside the fraternities parallels in almost exacting to Dale the same sort of accounts that have been given by former and even some current members of the SCV. And, as Elisa's reports indicate, if you think about it, this really shouldn't be surprising at all, because Figare and his number 2 guy Figare was also the founder of the fraternities. And in the early years, he and his number 2 guys were very much hands-on in terms of running the show, and in particular, forming the superiors who would form other members. And so the same patterns of, belittling people in order to, well, ostensibly justified by building character, but in reality, simply as a means of exercising control, turning a blind eye to abuse when it does happen, in some cases, almost actively encouraging it, invasion of privacy, separating people from their families, just in general, comporting in eerily similar ways to a sect. All of that is very much the same. Part of the tragic dimension of this story is that some of the leaders within the fraternities, who were, as Elisa's reporting documents, in many ways unquestionably guilty of abusive behavior, were themselves actually mistreated. And so this cycle of abuse and mistreatment simply repeated itself almost like a virus from which people are now trying to be cured. Anyway, I highly recommend Elisa's reporting on this. It is original and it is brilliant. All right, I am almost out of time. So, very quickly, two other stories on the Vatican beat in the past week. One of the really beloved Yuletide traditions here in Rome is the Vatican Christmas tree. Usually, this enormous tree set up in the middle of St. Peter's Square. It's a tradition that dates to 1982, and John Paul II, by tradition, some province or region of Europe every year is given the honor of providing the tree. This year, it comes from the Italian region of Treviso, up north. However, in this case, it has generated no small amount of controversy because Treviso is providing 40 fir trees, one of which is a massive, almost 100-foot tall tree that's at least a couple centuries old, known locally as the Green Giant. And environmental activists have circulated a petition which so far has generated more than 50,000 signatures, demanding that this tree not be cut down. And in general, blasting the tradition of the Christmas tree as a silly consumerist exercise, and, to add insult to injury, also an artifact of paganism rather than Christianity. And they've called upon Pope Francis, who obviously is very much an eco-pope, to side with them and to prevent the display of the tree. Local mayor, on the other hand, says this is all stuff and nonsense. That big tree, the Green Giant, was going to be cut down anyway as part of routine culling of the forest in keeping with the EU guidelines on forest maintenance and preservation. He quipped that if it didn't go to the Vatican, it was going to the sawmill. As far as the other 39 trees, he noted, they don't even come from Treviso because the Vatican wanted fir trees that don't shed their needles because they didn't want to spend the next month cleaning up those needles in St. Peter's Square every day. So they're buying them from a nursery. Anyway, point is, he's claiming it's sound and fury signifying nothing. We'll see what happens. Finally, King Kong. There was a guy this week who is known in Italy as the King of the Con, a serial offender, known as the most famous grifter in recent Italian history, who was busted at a post office a stone's throw from the Vatican, trying to use the driver's license of a guy who is currently the Pope's nuncio to Chad and the Central African Republic, which had been stolen by this guy. He was trying to use that driver's license and the guy's identity in order to get a loan. The post office here in Italy offers small loans to people who have bank accounts. And he was attempting to sort of weasel his way into one of these loans. He was foiled when a postal worker recognized this guy from a segment that had been broadcast about him on the Italian sort of comedy show Le Iene. And so he was arrested and taken into custody. Turned out it wasn't even the first time he impersonated a priest. And word to the wise, as the Jubilee year rolls around, Rome is going to be lousy in those days with grifters and cheats, some of whom are going to dress up as priests, even bishops, and attempt to defraud pilgrims in one way or another. The Italian police and the Vatican will do everything it can, but, basic, simple precautions are in order. If you're coming, be on guard. That's what I'm saying. Okay, that's our show for this week. As ever, you will find full coverage of all of these stories on the Crux site. That is cruxnow.com. Once again, I especially recommend reading Elisa's reports on the Fraternus. It's some of the most compelling reporting that you're going to read anywhere in the Catholic press right now. Anyway, all this stuff is on our site. We, meanwhile, will be back here next week, same bat time, same bat channel. In the meantime, for the next 7 days, my charge to you is to stay safe, stay healthy, have a blessed, joyful, and fantastic week, safe in the knowledge that we will talk to one another again very soon.